Okay, I think we'll get started. I hope you found at least one set of questions that made for an interesting discussion. I know that some of you are better than others at good tangents, so hopefully you found some of those too. And one of the things about this book and where we're at right now is we're in the Old Testament, and so things feel differently, kind of like we talked about in some of those introductory things, life in Israel in the Iron Age. That kind of transition is important, and so there's a lot of textual cues that you have to pick up on or that help flesh out a story. In the Old Testament, what tribe do the priests belong to?
Levites.
The tribe of Levi. So Levi, and the Levites are a group that help service the temple. They do kind of the grunt work, and they're somewhat akin to modern day deacons. If you listen to the readings about deacons, it often talks about Levites. And then within the tribe of Levi is the family of Aaron. And Aaron's family is the one to whom the priesthood belongs, at least for a while. But in the Old Testament, how is priesthood passed on? Where does the next generation come from? Their sons. So priesthood is genetic. Priesthood is you are born into the family. Now, does that always go well? How many of you have children that did not follow your occupation? You know, because that's kind of like one of the interesting parts of it is it doesn't really ask, do you want to be a priest? In this time in Israel, if you're born into this family, that's what you're going to be. And the world was much like that for more of history, like the crossing boundaries that we have now, where your career doesn't really have a relationship to your family and where you came from. That's very different. That's not very historical. That's not how people used to live. Now, it happens sometimes, but in a lot of cases, your occupation was your father's occupation and his father's occupation, and on back down the list. Like skills were passed on in that way. So this is important because Elkanah, who starts the story, Elkanah is the husband of Hannah, is an Ephraimite. And Ephraim is one of the northern tribes. So the southern tribes are Judah and Benjamin-ish and Simeon. So Judah is the tribe where Bethlehem is, that's south of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself is from the land. It's kind of from the land of the tribe of Benjamin, but eventually they sort of had kindergarteners redraw the lines, and so it gets called from the tribe of Judah. But that's the southern part. Ephraim is from the north. So I think the capital of the territory of Ephraim is Samaria. I think that's Ephraim. But it becomes more important as the story goes on. Elkanah seems to be a faithful man, but he has two wives. And one of the things you discover at this point in the Bible is the scriptures don't comment on polygamy like we would like them to. It doesn't come out directly and say polygamy is wrong. Hopefully not too many of you gave sour looks to your husbands about polygamy, because usually it's the men that are on the polygamous end of things. It's a lot easier for men to be polygamous than women in history because of childbearing and those kind of things. Scripture doesn't comment on it very directly. It doesn't say you shouldn't do this, at least at this point in history. I think Jesus argues that it does from the very beginning, that a man marries one woman, and he relates that all the way back to the story of Genesis. But at the very least, the people don't seem to consider it to be quite that way. But at the same time, the text really gives us the perspective that this isn't a great idea. How do you know that it's not a great idea?
Because they don't get along.
They fight.
They bully and fight.
They fight, yeah. And that's one of the things, like, we live in a very strange era in the modern world where more people are starting to talk about polygamy and open relationships, where people have more than one sexual partner. And that is realistically one of the results of contraceptives and separating sexual actions from the responsibility for them and the consequences of them. Once you do that, it's a lot easier to defend the lifestyle. But I wonder, because every time the story comes up, you end up hearing these kind of things. People are competing for attention, or they're jealous, or they're attacking each other. Or in the modern world, the relationship is so shallow that it's just sort of fluffy and will blow away with the wind. And that, I think, we're starting to see more of. People who live in such a way that they pretend like none of this has an impact on them, nothing of it really matters, it's all okay, we do it with permission, it's all fine, there's no jealousy at all. And I think, again, that's a sad consequence of living in the modern world and technological distraction and people not really thinking deeply about what love means and what commitment means and why love and commitment and marriage go together. That can be a real recipe for happiness. And so it's odd because most of you grew up in an era where the thought of polygamy was probably not even something that crossed your minds. Maybe adultery, a relationship outside of a marriage, but it was recognized as something wrong. And now our culture is changing around us to not really be able to comment on these things. Some of it is probably these compromises that have been made over the years, and once you compromise on some of the big things, you no longer have an argument about lots of the smaller ones. But there's a lot of animosity between the women, especially. The names in this story are also important. In the Old Testament especially, people's names often describe something very important about them. Names are related to identity. This is another thing in the modern world that I wish parents would take note of. Like, a name is related to an identity, and giving kids really, really weird names, you might think it sounds cute, but why? Like, there's this reality of giving someone a name that's meant to be something almost divine, of something that's being like God. God names the things in creation. He calls Adam to name the creatures. And that's not the sense of names that most parents have. And it's not that everyone needs to have the same names, or you can only use saint names, or those kinds of things. There's lots of good ones out there. But it's something I wish that parents would give a bit more thought to, and not just something that sounds nice or tickles their fancy, but in some cases I wish they would ask, is this going to be good for this child? Because your child is going to go through middle school. And that's good to keep in mind. Hannah's name means grace please, something like that. It's a little bit, when you translate some of these, it's a little bit hard, but Hannah's name means something like grace please. I was surprised to learn it's related to the name John. This is one of the really, really bizarre things that happens over time that you have to be careful with is sometimes names morph and they change. So like Guillermo in Spanish becomes William in English. Those are the same etymologically. And Sean in Irish or Gaelic is the name that's given for John. So sometimes sounds change, sometimes there's particular things. So Hannah is related to John, Yohanan, which means the Lord loves or the Lord grants grace. And John is a really strange name because it's a name that also shows up in Greek in the New Testament. So there's a Hebrew origin John that is Yohanan, and there's a Greek origin John that's like Ioannis. And those are different etymologically, but they come out the same in English. You see how dangerous the prospects are. Samuel means like heard by God, or he who is heard by God, or God hears. Something along those lines. So Hannah and Elkanah, it notes that they come to worship regularly. They're a faithful family. But already in the story, this is one of the places where details are really, really important, and you have to try and keep details in mind. Because it says they go up once a year and they go to the temple at Shiloh, not Jerusalem. The Jerusalem temple isn't built yet. That's the one that David will get the supplies for and Solomon will build. But they go to a temple at Shiloh and they go there once a year. Now, if you read the earlier pieces of the Old Testament carefully, it talks about going up to worship the Lord 3 times a year. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. They're only doing it once. Now, one possibility is because they're poor and don't have the money, and that could very well be. But I think it says that Elkanah was a rich man, so we have to chuck that opinion. You can tell that at this time, religious faith is sort of hanging on by a thread. This isn't a good time in the land of Israel. This is after the time of the judges. Things aren't going so well. They're going up once a year. Maybe that's the only time of year that people are allowed to come. Maybe it's the only time for a pilgrimage festival, something like that. But it already, like when you start, there's already gravel in the situation. There's already sandpaper. Someone's tracked mud into the kitchen. Because you don't get the impression in the story that there's a whole crowd of other people coming up to Shiloh to worship the Lord. Now, some of that is literary, that they're just talking about one family and one family's story, but it's a strange impression. You know, if there were thousands of people around, like in the stories of the time of Jesus, when Mary and Joseph go up to Jerusalem, there's crowds of people. Jesus gets lost in the temple. They're in a whole crew that came from Galilee or from Nazareth to the temple. That doesn't seem to be the case here. At the very least, the story doesn't comment on it. So Elkanah also makes a fatal error. He makes the women unequal. And this is, if you've raised children, you know that this is trouble. When you cut the cake, you cut pieces that are the same size, so that every kid gets the same piece, and not one is bigger than another, because if you do not, it will usually start a war and end up with bruised feelings. And Elkanah forgot this lesson, so he gives portions for sacrifice to the woman Peninnah, his other wife, and her children. They each get a portion. But to Hannah, he only gives one. Now, for a guy, it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. She's one person. There's 4 people or 10 people or however many there are. So they get 10 and you get 1. Everyone has 1. Everything's fine. That's not how Hannah takes it. And this continues for years. Again, this is a bit of a recipe for disaster. The fire is simmering, the pot is boiling for a long time. It's not just once and done. Hannah weeps in sadness. That this is one of the things that I think also speaks to the heart of many women, that childbearing is extremely important for women. And it strikes to the heart of identity and motherhood in a way that it doesn't for men usually. This is something that young couples sometimes have to wrestle with if they're going through the struggle of infertility and they're not able to have a child for whatever reason. It tends to be kind of like a midlife crisis for a wife, and it doesn't tend to be a midlife crisis for her husband. And that can lead to a lot of tension, this feeling that the man doesn't understand and he doesn't get why it's so important to me and my life is over and I can't be a mother. When you work with young couples that are going through infertility, you encounter this. Men tend to face the same kind of crisis if they don't have work and can't provide for their families. That tends to be something that bugs guys in the way that fertility is for women. She feels like the Lord doesn't hear her, and she's deeply distressed. I think that she is a great example for us and praying, because there's lots of times where you might feel unheard or where it seems like the Lord is distant. I think Hannah offers a good perspective on that. But she prays. She continues to bring her heart to the Lord. She offers to dedicate a son to him if she has a son. And there are further challenges. So once she starts praying and bowing down, most of us would be like, okay, now Lord, you can hear her prayer and answer her, like it should go well. She's doing this right. She's bringing it to you. But then she gets sort of attacked by the priest, who's kind of petty, who accuses her of being drunk. Like, dumb priest, don't do that. And that doesn't bode well for the priest. Like, again, you could feel gravel in the story. You can feel sandpaper in the story already, because it's not all going smoothly. There's problems in the priesthood. There aren't as many people worshiping. It's only once a year. There's this tension with polygamy. It's sort of set up, the landscape, the scenery is not of a faithful time and a time of blessing and encountering the Lord. The landscape that's set up is of a time of trial, a time of tremendous difficulty. I think we have to be careful, because part of the story is Hannah bringing her heart to the Lord. Prayers aren't magical, and it's not to find the right prayer or the right novena or the right saint, and if I would have just asked St. Jude instead of St. Peter, this person wouldn't have died, or this wouldn't have happened to me. If I said the novena and didn't miss a day, then it would change. And what that does is it puts all of the agency on ourselves. All of the action is up to us. Prayer is really about encountering the Lord and His heart and His desire, not about us and our own agency. And that's something that I think we have to be a bit cautious about and suspicious of, because there are times where it's easy to treat prayer like it's our agency. Well, I was distracted, or I didn't pray hard enough, or I didn't do this, or I didn't do that. And there's part of that that can be good. If you're distracted all the time, working on being less distracted or removing distraction is a good thing. If, you want to dedicate and commit to something particular, like, to say a prayer for 9 days, that can be a good thing. That's what a novena is. But again, they're not magical. It's not, I found this great novena that St. Gertrude used when, whatever was happening, and this is going to be how God is going to answer my prayer. That's treating prayers like they're magic. And the story of Hannah isn't like that. She has to pray for a long time for this to happen. But at least Eli is not completely lost, because he concludes his portion with, may the Lord give you your heart's desire. May the Lord grant your request. May the Lord grant your prayer. And he doesn't realize that that's prophetic, that he's speaking there in the office of his priesthood. maybe in spite of himself and his own troubles. It notes the Lord remembered her. This name, the Lord remembered, anyone know what name means the Lord remembered? He's a New Testament guy who was praying for a long time for a child with his wife. Zechariah. The Lord remembered is like his name, Zechar, is to remember. And the end of his name, like Zechariah, that part means the Lord when it gets translated from the Hebrew. So the Lord remembered. So the Lord remembered her. And again, I highlighted that. I put it in bold because I think those are important words to ponder the meaning of and to allow to unfold, that the Lord remembered her. He didn't forget her. She's not left out. And the plan is going to work out better, I think, than Hannah was hoping for. Samuel becomes a great man. He becomes the first prophet. He reestablishes Israel in a profound way. You could almost call him the second founder of Judaism after Moses, because it's really in Samuel that it takes a step out of this sandpaper and gravel time to actually worshiping the Lord, and he anoints the kings and establishes the monarchy, and the Lord is doing that through him. But the Lord remembers her in the midst of her distress. And that tension is something that shows up in Psalm 40, which we'll cover at the end. It shows up in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing I shall want. It starts off nice and pleasant, but the psalm is prayed, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And when you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, green pastures and plentiful food are not first and foremost in your mind. It's part of why the psalm is a prayer of faith, and where choosing to believe in the faithfulness of God, choosing to believe that he remembers you, living in communion with him is essential. So many of the passages in the Old Testament are like that. So the Lord remembers her, she conceives, and then does something strange. This is a little part that I can't figure out, because it notes that the next year she doesn't take the child up right away. And it could be that she's a little bit possessive, that she finally has this child and, she's really excited, kind of like the story of Ruth and Naomi that we covered in the book of Ruth. But for some reason, she doesn't go up right away. And the book doesn't seem to think that's a bad thing. Traveling with an unweaned child, that makes some sense that she wouldn't leave right away and go up. But in whatever way, she is happy. She stays with the child. And then I think this is part of her prayer. It says, may the Lord establish his word. Joshua, Judges, Samuel. So this is Elkanah, her husband. Do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. And I think that this is one of those places where English doesn't convey the full weight of what this is. Like, may the Lord establish his word. Again, this is a prophetic thing. If you think about the word of the Lord in the scriptures, that's about creation. And the word of the Lord that comes is the divine voice of God that speaks through the scriptures. May the Lord establish his word is a strong prayer. There's some meat to this. May the Lord build something that remains. Maybe conveys a bit of the sense of it. And word is related to the Word of God and Jesus, those words at the beginning of creation. God speaks, says, "Let there be light." God speaks His word when He reveals the 10 Commandments to the people. So when Elkanah says, "May the Lord establish His word," he's sort of relating to, whether consciously or unconsciously, we don't know, but he's relating to this deep strand and deep tradition that runs through Judaism about the importance of God's word. So they go to the temple and she brings a bull to offer sacrifice. Now, a bull is a grand sacrifice. This is like she's just bringing the kitchen sink to give to the Lord. She's excited out of, all to pieces, because a bull is a significant source of work for a family. A bull, they used bulls to help plow fields. You needed the strength. If you remember when we talked in our introduction, the Israelites, outside of the sacrifices, rarely killed animals because the animals were too valuable. Their products were too valuable. And so the fact that Hannah is bringing a bull speaks to the weight and the gravity of the sacrifice and the weight and the gravity of her thanksgiving. She is happy to bring this child to the Lord. So she brings the child back. She gives thanks to Eli. She gives thanks to God. He has remembered. He has heard me. Hannah's prayer takes up the first part of chapter 2. And this prayer should feel somewhat familiar. If you pray the Liturgy of the Hours, if you look at evening prayer, this prayer is related to the prayer of Mary that's called the Magnificat. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. It seems like Mary based her prayer on this prayer of Hannah. She notes that she exults in the Lord and rejoices in salvation. Her tears have been turned to joy. And I think, again, this is one of these important themes, because sometimes we feel very much like we're stuck in the valley of tears. And it's not that in this world all tears are going to turn into joy. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes there's pains and there's difficulties and there's struggles and there's trials. But there does come a day, even if it's on the other side of death, where tears do turn into joy, where things are transformed and they are changed. And so this kind of prayer gives us a model for that. It gives us a kind of confident hope and expectation that God will hear and will remember. And it notes that there is this strong theme of reversal in these scriptures. God seems to prefer using the weak and the lowly of the world, the people that in the eyes of the world count for nothing, to bring to nothing those who are something. That's the way St. Paul uses it in the New Testament. So God has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. Like the well-fed, go hungry, while those who are poor are filled. The one who has, like the barren wife bears 7 sons, and the mother of many is barren. There's this reversal that happens, that God isn't much occupied or flustered by the kind of obstacles that we have. We might say that, well, this is going to prevent, I can no longer do this, this isn't going to happen. God chooses the weak and the lowly in the world to bring shame to the strong and the wise. And there's so many examples of this in the scriptures. Hannah sort of considers herself to be this woman from nowhere. She is an Ephraimite, and not important in the grand scheme of things, and yet she becomes the mother of Samuel. If you look in our own day, Mother Teresa is a great example. She founded the Missionaries of Charity, which is by and large the most efficient, well-run, non-governmental organization in the world that feeds and clothes and houses more people than all kinds of government programs that are spent billions of dollars on. And she did it with donations and a will. She's from the middle of nowhere. She's from Albania, in a town that no one would ever heard of except for her. Jesus is from Nazareth. If you remember in the gospel, one of the disciples says before they know Jesus, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Nazareth is a little bit like some of these small ghost towns in the middle of North Dakota. In some ways, I feel like this is a little bit creepy because for those of us who say, we're from nowhere, we're not very important, we live in a not very important part of the world, it's like, those are the kind of people that the Lord likes to use. So there's definitely this reversal, and God seems fond of changing things around. She notes that all things are part of His plan. And her prayer ends with talking about, may the Lord bring strength to His king and to His anointed one. Now that's a little bit strange. May the Lord bring strength to His king. Sounds like a good prayer, right? Except you're missing one thing. You don't have a king. Who's she praying for? And the Lord's anointed one means, first of all, like kings and prophets were anointed with a horn of oil and priests were anointed with oil. But anointed one is the Hebrew name of the Greek Christ, the Messiah. And so already here you find this movement toward a Messiah who will come. Now, you have to be a little bit careful because is Hannah praying for the coming of Jesus? Do you think Hannah's praying for the coming of Jesus?
She doesn't know that she is.
She doesn't know that she is. That's a good start. Scripture can be true in more than one way and can, come to pass multiple times. And this is one of the places where I think you can see that, because I think Angie is exactly right. Like, Hannah probably doesn't have in mind Jesus, except for maybe dimly. Is the Lord drawing her heart? She's kind of caught up in the song of praise, and she prays about the Messiah and might wonder, well, where did that come from? The coming of the Messiah, the coming of the anointed one.
But the Torah talks about there being one. Could she be alluding to that?
When you say Torah, what do you mean?
Well, I mean the Jewish books of the Bible.
Okay, because Torah can mean like the first 5 books of the Bible. And one of the debates in Judaism is, do those books mention a coming Messiah? And the answer is not directly. Now, Jesus has an interesting argument about that as well. He says yes, because God is the God of the living, not the dead. And so when he mentions like praying to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Moses,